Okay, so today we have on this panel we have with us Nirnita Talukdar sitting at the end. Nirnita is the regional coordinator for Asia Pacific at UNEP FI. Then we have Constant van Aerschot. He is director of Asia Pacific at Accounting for Sustainability A4S, and we have Jong-O director at KoSIF, and then we have Karine Bueno. Karine is the individual review lead for the Principles for Responsible Banking at UNEP FI. I am Mustafa Chaudhry. I am the digital and events lead at UNEP FI. So this panel we're going to make it quite conversational, so please do feel free to ask any questions, jump in. You know, we want to hear your thoughts on this as well. And we're going to talk about embedding sustainability into the culture and governance of financial institutions. And the idea behind this is that, you know, embedding sustainability into the culture and governance requires a fundamental shift in the mindset from a short-term profit-driven approach to a long-term sustainable approach. It involves an enabling environment from top to bottom, bottom to top, and looking at how we embed sustainability into all departments of the organization is something that we'll look more into and hear different experiences about. So perhaps we can start with an opening question to set the scene, and we will start with Constant. So what does embedding sustainability into the culture and governance of an organization mean to you? And how do you think organizations can create a culture of sustainability that aligns with their values?
Thank you very much for the question. Well, we all know what culture is. It's basically a shared set of values, attitudes, and behavior that is characteristic for an organization. So every organization has different culture. So it can best be understood as, you know, the way things are being done here. So that's the starting point, I think, to understand the culture of an organization. And then the next step is about how to integrate sustainability into a business as usual processes. So that's where the crook is. And what's important to understand is to be able to change how we do business in a culture does not happen by accident. It needs to be designed. It needs to be designed at organizational level and not by department. So integrating sustainability into the way to do business is a long-term process for an organization. The first step to do is actually to create a baseline on what is my culture in my organization. And there are tools to do this. You can do a cultural survey. You know, how are business decisions being made locally, centrally? Do we encourage individual performance or teamwork? So those kind of surveys can be done to understand the culture of an organization. So that would be the starting point. So to your question in particular is how to do it is, well, what does it mean? It means a change management program at all levels of the organization. So it needs to be structured and systemic within an organization. And what's important to know is not one department can do a cultural change on its own. Cannot be isolated. So it should not be the sustainability department that has, it must be the whole organization. And it starts with the board of directors. If you don't have a board that understands the risks and opportunities linked to sustainability, then they cannot mandate the CFO team to change the criteria. The board needs to understand that it is a long-term issue, but there are risks and opportunities linked to it. So that's critical at the starting point of the board and investors. Then the strategy team, again, another very important function in the company, they need to embed sustainability in their strategic decision making or strategic plan, long-term strategic plan. And then the sustainability team, they need to be able to provide metrics, how to measure KPIs linked to sustainability that is good enough for the finance team to be able to use them. Then you have human resources department. They also need to understand that they need to provide training and data on human capital so that the finance team can do something with it. Then the communications team also need to understand how to craft the messages and the value creation of the company around sustainability. You cannot have, you know, just the business as usual kind of type of communication around this. And likewise, the CFO team or the finance team needs to be able to communicate meaningfully with the other departments so that they understand. And then, of course, the broader organization, they need to understand how value is being created. Yeah, so that's about, my point is, needs a holistic approach with the different departments understanding what change management means and how to change a culture to embed sustainability in the decision-making process.
Great, thank you very much, Constant. Let's move on to Jong-O. Perhaps would you like to talk about what sustainability means, as embedding sustainability into an organization means to you?
네. 제가 지속 가능성 관련해서 일을 하게 된 게 2007년도예요. 그 이후에 이제 기업들을 많이 방문을 좀 하는 때가 있었는데, 방문하면서 모 기업의 CSR 사무국의 국장을 좀 만난 바가 있습니다. 근데 그 국장이 예전에 필립스를 한번 다녀왔다는 거예요. 그러니까 필립스 본사를 다녀왔는데 가서 상당히 문화적인 충격을 받았다라고 이야기를 해요. 그래서 어떤 충격이냐라고 했더니 그 필립스 본사의 대형 그 펼침막이 들어가 있었는데 거기에 어떤 문구가 있었냐, Sustainability is in our DNA라는 그런 문구가 있었다라고 해요. 그래서 우리나라하고 이제 그걸 비교를 하면서 우리나라는 아마 그 당시 2003년이니까 그 당시에는 우리나라는 뭐 매출 매덕 달성 뭐 이런 식으로 프랜카드를 내는 것들, 그래서 재무적인 부분으로 내는 것들이었다면 필립스는 이제 그것을 대형 펼침막으로 이렇게 했다는 거예요. 여기서 저는 DNA에 저는 주목을 해요. 문화라는 것은 뭐 그 시대에 모든 사람들이 누릴 수 있고 또 하나의 어떤 그 뭐 동의하고 하는 어떤 과정일 수 있는데 DNA가 가지고 있어야만이 하나의 문화가 형성되지 않을까. 곧 DNA는 문화라는 생각이 드는 겁니다. 그래서 DNA를 가지고 있다면 아마 이제 자발적으로 또는 누가 이제 시민사회라든지 또는 정부 쪽에서 뭐 강제적으로 압박을 한다 하더라도 아마 기업은 자발적으로 움직일 수 있다라는 생각이 들고요. 그렇지 않으면 뭐 항상 수동적으로 대할 수밖에 없다라는 생각을 좀 하게 됩니다. 그리고 어떻게 그러면 그 부분들을 지속 가능성을 그 부분으로 통합시킬 것이냐라고 했을 때는 저는 A, B, C, D를 좀 이야기를 합니다. A는 첫 번째 어프로치에 대한 부분인 거죠. 어프로치에 대한 부분에서는 이런 부분이죠. 어떻게 보면 경영에 있어서 자신들이 보통 우리가 이제 우리 한국 사회에서는 그 ESG 위원회를 많이 만들잖아요. ESG 위원회를 뭐 거의 많은 기업에서 만들고 있는데 실제로 그 부분들을 경영에 통합하고 있지 않습니다. 많은 기업들이 그냥 위원회만 만들어 놓고 그냥 지나가는 거죠. 특히 위원회에서는 실제로 ESG 관련된 주제를 다루고 있느냐, 다루고 있지 않다라는 거죠. 일상적으로 이 사회에서 하는 것들이 안건으로 올라오고, 물론 그것도 지속 가능성에 대한 이슈라고 생각할 수 있지만 아무튼 대부분이 좀 지속 가능성에 집중된, 포커싱된 그런 어떤 안건이 아니라 다른 안건을 좀 다루고 있다라고 이야기를 하고 있습니다. 두 번째로는 이제 비즈니스 모델을 개발을 해야 된다. 어떤 식으로 간에 왜냐하면 아무리 ESG를 잘한다 또는 지속 가능성을 잘한다라고 하더라도 이 지속 가능성에 대한 부분이 스스로의 어떤 수익으로서 증명되지 않으면, 그것이 리턴되지 않으면은 결국은 그 기업이 지속 가능할 수 없는 거고 결국은 또 불만이 나올 수밖에 없는 거고 그 기업은 망할 수밖에 없는 거죠. 그런 점에서 어떤 식으로든 간에 그 비즈니스 모델을 개발을 해야 된다라고 생각을 하고 있고요. 세 번째 컴펜세이션에 대한 보상에 대한 부분입니다. 어떤 식으로 지속 가능성 부분들은 굉장히 장기적인 과제이기도 하고 태가 나지 않는 과제입니다. 그래서 적어도 여기에 근무하고 또 여기에 열정을 쏟는 그런 직원들에 대해서 지속 가능한 성과 관리를 분명히 해야 되고요. 거기에 맞게 보상 체계가 만들어져야 된다고 생각합니다. 그럼 마지막에 디스클로저에 대한 부분이죠. 이해관계자의 초점을 맞춰서 자신들이 정보를 최대한 공개할 수 있도록 하는 그런 어떤 A, B, C, D에 대한 부분이 하나의 어떤 지속 가능성에 대한 부분들을 그 금융기관의 하나의 문화로 만들 수 있지 않을까라고 생각을 합니다. 또 마지막으로 그러한 바탕들은 어디에 비롯되어 있냐? 저는 컴플라이언스 체계의 기본으로 이제 돼 있다고 생각합니다. 그러니까 특히 요즘 이제 ESG 워싱에 대한 이야기가 많이 나오는데 그런 어떤 철저한 컴플라이언스 체계를 구축한 이런 상태 내에서의 그 A, B, C, D가 이루어져야 된다고 생각을 하고 있고요. 이 활동들은 다 모두 어떤 ESG 워싱이 되지 않도록 조심해야 된다라는 거고요. 또 하나는 보통 우리가 이제 우리나라 기업도 그리고 다른 나라 어떤 기업도 대부분 뭐 그런 기업도 많은데 대부분 이 지속 가능성 문제는 정말 장기적인 과제이기 때문에 탑다운이 아니면은 실제로 오래 실행되기 쉽지 않습니다. 그런 점에서 첫 번째는 CEO가 의지를 가지고 탑다운으로 이렇게 내리꽂는 이런 방식이 기본적으로는 효과적이다. 물론 그것이 얼마나 효과적이냐에 대한 부분들은 제가 실증한 바는 없지만은 적어도 처음 시작은 그렇게 해야 된다. 그리고 그러한 것이 좀 퍼졌을 때는 아까 말한 것처럼 종업원들을 바텀업으로 그 부분이 이제 올라오는 이 두 가지가 다 총체적으로 이루어져야만이 지속 가능성에 대한 문화가 되지 않을까라는 생각을 하는 거고요. 또 하나는 이제 근로자에 대한 어떤 지속 가능성에 대한 교육이 정말 중요하다고 저는 느끼고 있습니다. 지금도 우리가 ESG 지속 가능성 관련해서 많은 어떤 기업에서 이야기를 하지만은 어느 한 부서에서는 나는 지속 가능성은 상관없어라고 이야기하는 부서 굉장히 많거든요. 그랬을 때는 전 조직이 어떤 지속 가능 문화를 만들어내지 못하는 거죠. 상품팀에서는 지속가능 상품을 만들고 있지만은 다른 팀에서는 이 상품하고는 전혀 별개로 놀고 있는 이런 어떤 상황이라고 봐야 되는 거죠. 그런 점에서 저는 각 부서마다 자신들이 하고 있는 일과 지속 가능성을 어떤 식으로 간에 연결시켜서 교육하는 과정이 저는 필요하다고 봅니다. 그런 어떤 부분들이 좀 총체적으로 이루어졌을 때 지속 가능한 어떤 문화를 형성시킬 수 있지 않을까라고 생각합니다. 이상입니다.
Great, thank you very much, Jong-O. I think you bring up a very important point on ESG washing and whether setting up an ESG committee or setting up a sustainability team, whether that means an organization is actually sustainable or not. Perhaps we can dive deeper into that a little bit later. But let's move on to Karine. Karine, what does embedding sustainability into the culture of an organization mean to you?
Hello. Hi. Okay. So I fully agree, I think, with both of you. I think there's a discussion in compensation that we put to later, because I don't think it's only long term. I think we need also to start seeing and compensating starting now, but we leave it for later. So in my view, I think two things. So sometimes we talk about governance and people only relate to, for example, high-level governance, the ESG committees that are extremely important and a board level. So usually people think, okay, governance is, top-down approach, having the right, structures in place, and this is very important, and this is the starting point of a good governance structure. But I think the other thing we need to think about is all the other systems, as also Constance said, on how do we cascade, not only the board's discussion, the governance structures, but into process, into systems, into things that make a culture to be a concrete thing in the daily life of the employees, right? So I think it's important that we understand governance as, a broader concept. So this is my first point. And I think to the points in terms of culture, I really believe that is, a top-down, bottom-up approach. So the role of training, as you also mentioned, it's a new topic for most of the people, so even for us in our individual lives, we want to do better, but how to do it? So I think it's, we need to create like the values, the things that go on the wall, the nice, sayings, the good communication materials, to explain what this means. But how do we translate that on how to do things? So I think in my experience, a lot of people were willing to do, and were willing to make a positive impact. This is something that talks with us as individual, right? But then again, it's not just a soft skill thing, not just a behavioral skill. Going back to my first point, you need to have the systems in place that encourage, that remunerate, that help employees to see that this is the real direction that the bank and the company is going. So it's not just a saying, it's not just a nice slogan, but it's something that it is valued in your day-to-day work. You're going to be, your job description is going to be defined by this, your compensation is going to be related to this, long-term direction that you have. So I think, again, two main points is, it's not just a top-down thing, it's a top-down, bottom-up, but you need to have the right systems in place to, to make it real.
Great. And Nirnita, what do you think?
Thanks, Mustafa. I think most of the points have kind of already been talked about, but I think just to add, one of the main things that we were talking about yesterday also was in terms of impact analysis. And so why are we even doing this? Why is this important? So looking at why is it important for your bank, I think gives you an imperative for the things to change. There is obviously and on a broader level, I think there's the social imperative that, we're seeing so many disasters in Asia Pacific, we're seeing so many things happen, you're seeing how marginalized populations are getting affected. That's also your, that's the people who are investing in you, they are the local communities you're working with. So why does that matter? So that's one thing. We heard in today's session about how this is a business opportunity. So kind of understand that, and obviously there is the risk imperative totally. And I think, again, to add to what has been said, but in a lot of countries in Asia, you see sustainability kind of being one person or one team, or even if there might not even be a team, it's mostly either the risk team or mostly the people who have to do the reporting for compliance. They are the ones who's actually looking at sustainability. And I think that for that to change, there obviously needs to be a lot of things that we've discussed today, there needs to be a fundamental shift, but also there needs to be a lot of capacity building. There needs to be a buy-in from the leadership. And for that to happen, there needs to be an understanding of why sustainability is important. How can that be driving the business and profits? I think that's quite important.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for some really important points. I think, I myself work in communications as well, and I'm just thinking about what you said about the slogans, and I think the slogan for this panel should be, sustainability go beyond the slogan, right? Because that's not what makes somebody sustainable. But Karine, let's talk about your experience. So Karine has a very interesting profile. Karine was the head of sustainability at a large bank in Brazil. Now she works for UNEP. I will cover that a little bit later. But can you talk about your experience being head of sustainability in a large bank in Brazil? What challenges did you face? How did you find working with other departments? What did you learn, and what did you wish had been different?
Thanks, Mustafa. It's nice to go back 2 years, in the past, yeah. But so just to put into context, I worked in banks with sustainability for 20 years, so I started in 2002. So I think the first thing that comes to my mind is it's not a linear journey, right? So in the past 20 years, I saw the topic going up and down, getting more traction, getting really less traction, and then in the past, I think 3-4 years, really making the board's agenda, investors, discussions, and et cetera, but it's not a linear, I think, progress. So I think also from, a perspective of a former head of sustainability, I think one thing is, sometimes it's a lonely, function as well, because, like in my case, you have a lot of passion, you want to make it happen, you make all the, you know, the speeches, what is important. You bring all the international standards or, you know, the national challenge to the table. And you need to build your alliances also within the bank. So I think there's, you know, one piece of the culture and governance that is the formal, you know, governance. So of course, you know, I had the buy-in. It's just one another, you know, context is that I've worked for, you know, 2 different large banks, and I said, okay, I cannot do it anymore. And then I left the bank, stayed 3 years, like working as a consultant and in an NGO. And then the bank, the former bank, actually asked me to come back and to, you know, to step in as the head of sustainability. And the first thing that I asked is it for real, right? Because I'm not going to spend my next years here trying to do something if the leadership doesn't, believe that this is for real, this is strategic, this is a business thing. So I did have, you know, support from top leadership, but at the same time, if you don't build your alliances, you know, with the business areas, with the risk departments, with the CFO, you know, that will need to take that to investors, for example, you can have top-level commitment, but it will be very hard for you to translate that and to, you know, make things happen in reality, right? The CEO or the board, they're not going to be there all the time with you. So, you know, I think the first thing for me was, okay, which departments, you know, which are the people actually that I need to build a strong relationship, because they are crucial, you know, for us to achieve what we want from a business perspective, from an impact perspective. So I think the first thing for me was, okay, who are my, you know, allies? And the ones that are not my allies, you know, how can I, again, overcome, and how can I bring elements, you know, arguments to the table that help them see what's the business value. So I think, you know, I'm super passionate about, but, you know, my passion does not convince other people. They are convinced by what's the business value that we can offer. What's the benefit for my annual result in my department? So I think for me, it is, you know, some key things for me is, one is it's extremely needed to have, of course, you know, high-level support. It's not sufficient, but you need to work with your allies and, you know, find who are your partners there. And you need to change your arguments with every people and every department that you talk. And I think one thing that you've also mentioned, Constant, is, you know, how do people in the front line actually see sustainability, right? And, you know, large bank, retail bank all over the country in Brazil, and they usually relate, so people in the branch, they usually relate to social projects. And again, it's a very cultural thing also in Brazil, and also to eco-efficiency, you know, actions that we were taking inside the bank, because this is what they see. This is what they relate every day. So, you know, coming to a more business discussion with the front line is also, you know, key.
I find it hard to believe people don't find your passion convincing. But let's, you know, speaking from talking about you working with all the teams, let's move on to then Constant. I know that you work with finance teams across different industries, organizations. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit more about how you're working with finance teams, and what do they need to look into a little bit more? What challenges do you face?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so very often in companies, the finance team is seen as a big barrier, because, you know, they have very fixed performance targets, internal rate of returns or payback period, and those things. So the finance function is actually seen as a main barrier if they are not trained to understand what sustainability is. And so there are 4 typical barriers. First one is time pressure. The finance team is under tremendous pressure for time because of monthly or quarterly financial reporting. So this is at odds to what sustainability is about long-term thinking. So the response to the time pressure barrier or challenge is actually to say that we have to organize the team so that we can address both. the short-term pressure and the long-term thinking and the underlying financial processes to tackle long-term sustainability challenges from a financial perspective. And we talk about transition plans and all these things, so that's where it fits in. The second big challenge in finance team is perception. Many accountants and finance team think, well, sustainability is fluffy, it's tree hugging, we cannot quantify it, so it's just the opposite of what finance is about. So the response of this is, actually that's not true. So this perception is wrong because we can measure almost everything. We can even measure the intention of a person to vote. So you can measure energy, water consumption much more accurately than the intention of someone, how they want to vote. So it's about looking at, for the finance team, to understand the impacts and dependency on social and human capital. And actually, the natural capital protocol and those tools exist to be able to quantify, to put a value on the impact and dependencies. You don't necessarily need to go that way, but you can. So training, and you mentioned this earlier, training accountants and the CFOs in understanding how to capture those sustainability KPIs and how to translate them in dollar value is actually quite more and more common, I must say. The third big challenge is relevance. Finance people think sustainability is for the CSO, is not for us. So it is really to understand that if the finance team does not look at ESG factors, it forgoes a lot of opportunities and maybe destroys value. So they are absolutely relevant, they just don't know it necessarily. And then the last one last big challenge that finance teams have is really the experience. Do they have the skills? Do they know how to do it? Again, it goes back to what we said earlier about training, etc. And also, the macro trends on sustainability are hard to quantify. So we all go back to our comfort zone to say what it's predictable is more comfortable for me to use. So these are the kind of 4 challenges, and for all those, the A4S is providing support to change those perceptions that finance team cannot do anything about it. So that's completely wrong. So they can do something about it.
Great, thank you very much. Let's move on to Jong-O. You mentioned, you in your previous response, you mentioned the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. Could you perhaps maybe elaborate on that a little bit more, and talk a little bit more about how leadership can engage with employees, or vice versa, in really making sure that sustainability is a core value for the organization?
네, 여러분 가위 많이 보시죠. 가위를 저는 보면은 세상의 이치가 담겨 있다는 생각을 참 많이 하게 돼요. 저 가위를 보시면 날이 2개잖아요. 근데 날 하나만 가지고는 종이를 자를 수가 없어요. 양날이 다 있어야 돼요. 저는 그 한 날을 실용의 날이라고 생각하고요. 또 한 날은 그래도 실용만 있으면 안 되지 않습니까? 적어도 명분이 있어야죠. 그래서 명분의 날이라고 저는 생각합니다. 근데 그것보다 더 중요한 게 있습니다. 많은 사람들이 주목하지 않는 부위가 있거든요. 그게 바로 그 가위의 양날을 이어주는 조그마한 나사. 이것을 우리말로 사북이라고 합니다. 사북. 이 사북이 없으면 사실은 가위가 작동을 안 합니다. 워킹을 안 하는 거죠. 두 번째, 이 사북이 이 나사가 빡빡하게 조여 있다라고 해도 이게 작동을 안 하죠. 그리고 헐겁게 돼 있다라고 해도 작동을 안 합니다. 그럼 저는 그래서 이 가위에서 가장 중요한 부위는 날이 아니라 실제적으로 나사다라고 생각합니다. 제가 왜 이런 말을 한다면 그 나사가 사실은 어떤 조직으로 말한다면 거버넌스의 정점에 있다고 생각합니다. 거버넌스라고 생각하고 있고요. 또 그 거버넌스에 대한 부분들은 저는 그 어떻게 보면 저기 리더십하고 연결시킵니다. 그 여러분들 보시기에 가히의 이 조그만 나사는 보이지 않지만은 작동을 하게 하잖아요. 모든 일들을 작동하게 하잖아요. 저는 리더십을 그렇게 판단합니다. 누가 이렇게 저렇게 해라고 시키고 뭐하고 이게 아니라요. 조용히 그 부서에서 작동하도록 워킹하도록 이렇게 뭔가를 촉진시켜주고 도와주고 하는 이것이 저는 리더십이라고 생각을 저는 하게 되거든요. 그런 점에서 제가 가히를 이야기하는 거고요. 또 하나는 약간 이제 어떤 직원을 갖다가 어떻게 지속 가능성의 어떤 노력에 참여시킬 것이냐, 뭐 이런 어떤 부분하고 또 하나는 조직의 지속 가능성에 대한 목표에 기여하도록 할 것이냐 이렇게 했는데 저는 많은 사람들이 뭐 저도 그렇지만 여러분들 중거 집단이라는 게 있잖아요. 여러분 다 중거 집단에 지금 계시나요? 계신 사람도 있을 것이고 계시지 않는 사람도 있을 거예요. 저는 한국 사회책임자 포럼이 일단 저의 중거 집단이에요. 그래서 한국 사회책임자 포럼으로 저는 생각을 하고 있습니다. 소속 집단이기도 하지만 중거 집단. 많은 종업원들이 소속 집단하고 중거 집단이 일치하면은 당연히 이 모든 기업은 잘 될 수 있겠죠. 근데 그렇지 못한 게 현실이기도 하고 소속 집단과 중거 집단이 일치하는 종업원들은 사실은 거의 없을 겁니다. 드물죠. 근데 일치시키도록 리더십을 가진 사람들이 발휘를 하고 노력하고 하는 것이 중요하다고 저는 생각을 합니다. 그러면 이게 나올 수가 있겠죠. 어떻게 하면 참여시킬 것이냐라고 했을 때 기업을 좀 종업원 친화적으로 변화시켜야 되는데 종업원의 니즈에 맞게 변화시켜야 되는데 첫 번째 기업의 목표와 저는 지속 가능성에 대한 목표 이 부분들을 명확하게 그 종업원들한테 제시해 줘야 된다라고 생각합니다. 이 두 가지가 왜 같이 존재하는지 나는 무엇을 가지고 해야 되는 기업 목표하고 지속가능 목표가 달라버리면 서로 상반되는 결과를 낳는 달라버리면 그 종업원들은 헷갈릴 수밖에 없죠. 결국은 참여를 못하게 되는 거죠. 중도에 하다가 그만두게 된다고 저는 생각을 합니다. 또 하나는 직원들이 그 목표로 향해 갈 수 있도록 권한을 줘야 돼요. 그 권한에서는 예산이 있고요. 그다음 어떤 공간일 수 있고요. 시간일 수도 있고요. 이런 여러 가지가 있습니다. 또는 교육일 수도 있고요. 그런 것들을 충분하게 줄 필요가 있다. 그래야지 참여 가능하게 하고 그 사람이 그쪽에서 지속 가능성 목표에 동의하고 준 거의 어떤 행위로서 하게 된다라는 생각을 하게 됩니다. 또 하나는 아까 이제 우리 카린께서 협력이라는 부분, 누구를 파트너 할 것이냐라는 이야기를 하셨는데 저는 정말 좋은 리더십은 협력에 대한 공간을 만들어줘야 한다고 생각해요. 조직 안에서 그렇죠. 조직 안에서 인원이 몇 명밖에 안 돼요. 안 되는데 이 두 명이서 어떤 100이라는 것을 감당해야 한다. 못하죠. 그러면 옆에 부서한테 협력할 수 있고 도와달라라고 요구할 수 있고 또 하나는 그 조직 내에서도 해결 안 되면은 다른 협력회사 또는 NGO, 지역사회 뭐 이런 식으로 협력 파트너들한테 자유롭게 도와달라라고 할 수 있는 그런 분위기를 만들어주는 것 이게 중요하다고 저는 보고 있습니다. 또 하나는 이제 마지막으로 이제 아까도 이야기 나눴는데 어떤 지속 가능성에 대한 부분들은 어떤 식으로 그래도 성과라는 관리는 필요하지 않습니까? 그래야지 어디까지 와 있고 어디까지 가야 되는데 지금 어디 지체해 있다 또는 어디까지 빨리 가고 있다라는 현 지점을 알 수 있기 때문에요. 그래서 그 직원들한테 아까 보상 체계를 확실히 만들어줘야 된다라는 생각을 또 다시 한번 하게 됩니다. 네, 사실은 지속 가능성에 대한 길은 저는 상당히 뭐 무슨 선택의 길처럼 이미 나 있는 길 중에 어느 하나를 선택하는 건 아니라고 생각하거든요. 이미 지속 가능한 길은 누구도 가보지 못했고 그래서 저는 개척의 길이라고 봐요. 그래서 지속 가능성에서 관련해서 일을 하시는 분들은 정말 충분한 보상을 받아야 되고 그럴 때만이 실제로 아까 이제 바텀업하고 탑다운 이야기 하셨는데 탑다운은 어느 강력한 카리스마를 가진 또는 카리스마 아니다 하더라도 적어도 확고한 철학을 가진 지속 가능성의 그런 CEO가 와서 할 수 있어요. 근데 그건 장기성을 보장하지 못할 수도 있죠. 왜냐하면 그 CEO는 계속 있는 것이 아닐 수도 있기 때문에 그런 바텀업이라는 부분이 돼야 되는데 그 바텀업은 바로 그런 CEO들이 기본적으로 만들어주는 거고 그런 문화를 형성했을 때 만들어질 수 있다고 보는 거거든요. 그런 조직들, 중고집, 나는 중고집 안에 있어 라고 생각하는 그런 종업원들, 근로자들이 많아졌을 때 그런 바텀업에 대한 그런 가버넌스 부분들은 형성된다라고 저는 생각합니다. 이상입니다.
Thank you very much. Let's talk about lots of banks now. Karine, you as the PRB review lead speak to banks every single day about the progress they're making on sustainability goals, the principles for responsible banking. When you're speaking to banks, what are you seeing? What do you think banks, how are they embedding sustainability into their culture of governance, or how are they not doing it? What do you think they could be doing better, or do you have any great examples to share?
Okay. As Mustafa said, more than 300 banks all over the world, different sizes, different business models. So it is expected that, culture is not the same, cultural processes are different. So every time we need to put that into perspective as well. So one of the principles is governance and culture. We understand that this is the foundation actually, so you're able to understand the impact and, put the targets in place and really, changing portfolios. So this is a very crucial principles for responsible banking. And it's very good to see actually that the big majority of the banks that we talk, they do have systems in place to overlook and to have oversight of the sustainability practices that they see and etc. What is hard to assess is, are they effective? Are they effective? Is the discussions actually that they describe that they're having in the board, are they strategic, because it's not enough to have two board discussions. It's, okay, what's the content of the discussion? So I think in terms of good examples, we do have some banks that disclose, for example, the percentage and the time that the board allocated to the topics, for example. Some banks disclose what are the topics that board discussed there. Some of them disclose, how the climate targets actually are being approved by the board. So I think it's also, we see that first, the banks state that they have a governance structure in place. And every time that you go public, I think this is an important commitment actually that the bank is doing. So this is a positive thing. The other thing is we see a lot of banks, developing their training programs as well. So not only for the staff, and we do have some banks that are putting now mandatory ESG training for staff. So in the specific topics like climate, for example, but also, more general things. And we see a lot of effort on training the board actually on, to understand what the climate implications are and, to be better equipped also to decide and to recommend and to give strategic advice. So I think there's a recognition that, the board also needs to be, again, educated, more and more in terms of these topics, but we also see this happening. The other thing that I think it's interesting actually is some banks are including that in compensation, so my point to you is it's not like the majority of the banks, but we see this happening. And one thing, it's still non-financial, right? So it's non-financial indicators that will affect, compensation of specifically, executives, but also some specific functions in the bank. And we have a couple of banks actually that already include the achievement of the reductions, the climate reductions in the compensation. So it's not only saying that we are going to have a net zero, target, but it's really, okay, I have a net zero target already. So for this year, this is what it was achieved, and this is, the compensation and how it affects. So I think it's, again, not sufficient just to have it, in the overall compensation, but the more and more you can go specific, the better. And just my last point, I think, in terms of compensation is, if you're talking with a commercial person, like in the CIB, in the investment banking, it takes more time for them to put a green deal in place or a sustainable finance deal in place than what they call plain vanilla, just, a regular deal. So it takes more time, it takes effort, it takes more discussion with the risk committee, for example, and they get the same compensation. So I think in terms of compensation is also how do you structurally change, how the employees also, are, again, financially compensated. And just two small things here, Mustafa, I know that I don't have much time, but I think, the way forward also is to have this more, as you said, more holistic understanding, also from a board level. What I see is that a lot of the discussions are still based on climate. And this is good. Actually, it crossed the barrier actually and reach the board, but it's still too much focus. The social elements still need to be, put into account, and how does it affect the business? How are we going to deal with that responsibly? So I think, the more and more we have this holistic view, the better. And just a provocation to my colleague Constant here, the CFOs need to help to translate that as well. So, we need to provide the KPIs, but I don't see that much reflected still when we, look to the overall perspective of banks.
Thank you very much. I think it's interesting that we are having conversations around compensation. I remember a couple of years ago at one of our roundtables, we spoke to Mark Carney, who at that time suggested that maybe executive compensation should be linked to sustainability goals, and that made headlines because nobody was talking about it. So I think it's good to see that we are having these conversations, and banks are having these conversations as well. Moving on to capacity building and looking at how we're supporting the development of colleagues and integration of the principles of responsible banking specifically. Nirnita, would you like to tell us a little bit more about the Principles for Responsible Banking Academy?
Sure, thanks, Mustafa. So I think what we were talking about earlier in terms of there is a need for both top-down and bottom-up approach, and when you were also talking about how can we engage with CFOs. So what PRB Academy, so we have a new program that we started last year and the PRB Academy basically works as a large-scale training program for banking professionals at different levels in there. So we have a separate training program for governance and CEOs, etc. Then we have another training program that specifically only engages with relationship managers to look at how to engage with clients and customers. And we have two much more detailed, very specific program that is working with the risk management team, and then there is the one which working with the sustainability team. The idea is that, and obviously the depth kind of differs from one another, but the idea is that this will provide an understanding at a large scale to a lot of bankers out there to understand why is sustainable finance important for them and what they can be doing within their capacity, within their role. So beginning of this year, we had the first global pilot that took place in India. And yesterday you heard Ms. Geetu Joshi from the Ministry of Finance talking about how in India this is still a very niche topic which is emerging at this moment. So one of the things that we realized when we did this 4-day training, the pilot training, and we had a number of participants, and on the first day it was a dialogue between just governance bodies in terms of the board members and the CEOs, and after that what we saw is after that meeting a number of board members actually came back to us to ask them to come and talk about sustainable finance within their bank board meetings as a part of the board meeting agenda. It was kind of put in. So we feel that the more you're able to engage at the broader level, I think it's easier to then percolate and ensure that we're able to embed sustainability within the culture if we are able to, again, be able to talk about this at both, at every function of the bank. Thank you.
How can people sign up? How can people sign up?
So we have an online website. It's called PRB Academy. So you can, but in Asia, we're also trying to see how we can have a lot more localized content. But obviously, it cannot happen in every country in Asia. So we're trying to see how we can be doing this.
And you can already sign up to the online courses at prbacademy.com. So please do go have a look at the training programs for different professionals within different banks. Okay, so I'm very aware of the time. We do need to wrap up soon. Just very quickly, what's on everyone's wish lists for next steps into embedding sustainability into the culture and governance of not just banks, but into different organizations. Let's start with you, Karine.
Okay, it's a wish list, right? It's really like this, cultural transformation mindset that we all feel, okay, we do have a share of responsibility. This is the job that I do, irrespectively of the area that I work at, and I need to put my best effort to promote the best effort. So I think, when as society, not only as business, we have this cultural shift, then, we'll solve out how to get the metrics, we'll solve out how to make business, so, everything will be easier.
And Jong-O next.
네, 마지막인가요? 마지막인가요?
Yes.
예. 예. 지금 아까 질문 쪽으로 그대로 해서요.
Oh, so what is on your, so we are running out of time, so just within 1 minute, what is on your wish list that would really help embed sustainability into organizations?
일단 저는 지속 가능성을 조직에 내재화시키기 위해서는 기업이나 금융기관이나 그 동떨어진 데서는 스스로가 할 수는 없다고 봅니다. 그러니까 외부의 어떤 식으로 간의 어떤 압력이든 또 요구든 그런 것들이 좀 있어야만 한다는 생각해요. 그런 점에서 저는 그 지속 가능성이 제대로 시행되려면 적어도 이해관계자의 많은 요구를 받은 법과 제도와 정책이 외부에서 기본적인 어떤 포스트로 세워져야 된다고 생각을 하고요. 그것을 내부에서 받았을 때는 컴플라이언스 체계가 탄탄하게 구축돼야 된다. 그리고 종업원과 또는 뭐 노사 어떤 여러 가지 어떤 이해관계자 간에 서로 연대와 협력과 상생의 정신이 필요하다라고 생각합니다. 그게 이제 지속 가능한 길을 열어젖히는 어떤 방법이 아닐까 생각을 합니다. 이상입니다.
Constant.
Yeah, so 1 minute, one wish. My wish
Or 1
is that
minute,
there's
many
a
wishes.
tremendous surge in downloads from the guides from A4S, typically on capital investment appraisals, how to embed ESG in CapEx, how there's a special guide on budgeting, forecasting for finance people. So there are a lot of those guides that actually show that you can actually embed ESG factors in financial processes. So yes, so my wish is a lot of downloads of those essential guides on those very technical aspects so that they cannot say we don't know how to do it.
Great. Your communications team will thank you for your answer. Nirnita.
Yeah, I think the first thing is in terms of capacity building and obviously wish list, but in Asia, every country is different. So there needs to be a lot more regional, localized content when we are talking about capacity building. So as UNEP FI with the PRB Academy, obviously we're providing a more global framework, but as we go forward, we're really hoping that banks within Asia are able to integrate that, like make some changes, have much more local content within that, and then ensure that every individual within their banks are able to get access to this content. I do know of one bank in Asia that's actually already starting this process. So really hoping that as we move forward, that's going to happen. And sorry, second wish list, because I don't think my 1 minute's over. But in terms of that, this is not a journey as we've spoken about. There's going to be, I mean, everyone needs to be kind of working together. There are so many organizations, there are so many banks, there are regulators, everyone's working in silos. There's a major need for people to kind of come together and work together to ensure that sustainability is actually integrated within the banking system.
Thank you very much, Nirnita. So maybe the next time we're back here in this room, in a few years, let's see how different the conversations are, and perhaps we can have the exact same panel. But thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for your time. We'll end this panel now.